Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. And those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we're here with Peter Schuck again, the Director of Special Projects at Paradigm. On our previous conversation, we were talking about how Peter got into audio in the first place, how we moved to Ottawa and kind of jumped into the NRC research and the Athena project and all of that. Today we're back and we're kind of picking up where we left off and seeing where he went from there. Now, welcome back, Peter.
Hello, Jorden. Nice to be back.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for kind of giving so much of your time. There is so much to kind of talk about. And I guess where we left off with the Athena project and all of that, the question that I have is, if you were to reduce all of that research, all of those years of hard work to kind of the most important point, was there one kind of most important point that you kind of left with based on that research?
Yeah, the main idea was that if you're going to design some kind of equalizer or filter to try to do something about the room interaction, that if you design it to only work in one specific location, then you're more than likely to cause other locations in the room to be even worse and to cause, putting a lot of excess energy into the room. It's just not going to work because at high frequencies, your two ears are too far apart to be in the same transfer function. So you need to do something in terms of considering multiple locations or a whole listening area to get some kind of control of the sound field in the room.
Interesting. So with that, and with the kind of Athena project wrapping up, what was next for you? What kind of happened at the end of all of that? Where did you go from there?
So when we first started at Paradigm, both Mark and I joined Paradigm. Mark was the designer of the hardware for the Athena project. And the first thing was to try to make the DSP box more practical, because we had this BSP box in the end that we did lots of our experiments with in the room with equalizers, and but that wasn't commercially viable. So I started looking at using IIR filters instead of FIR filters, because we were effectively doing minimum phase equalization of some sort. And IIR filters are extremely efficient at creating minimum phase filtering. And they're easy to implement as long as you're careful about noise and noise feedback and things like that. But you can do it on a DSP of that era. So I spent a lot of time looking at how to reformulate the problem as a IIR equalizer design. And then
I'm going to ask a very silly question. What is IRR versus FIR? What do those mean?
Okay, so an FIR filter is a filter that only looks at, is basically an average of some sort. So you look at the samples as they come in, and you apply a weight to each sample, and you multiply them and add them all up, and that's the output. So that has no feedback. And IR filter does that and also looks at the past outputs and adds combinations of the past outputs to predict the new output. So instead of just predicting the output from the inputs, which is the FIR way, you're calculating the output from past inputs and past outputs. So the using the pass outputs makes it a feedback filter.
Very cool. So and maybe I might have missed it there, but essentially the Athena project ended. Both you and it was Mark Bonneville, right?
Right.
Both you and Mark started at Paradigm. Was Paradigm looking for that more advanced research, or how did that come about? Was the audio industry then in a time where they actually had the money and the desire to kind of fund more advanced research?
Paradigm did. I guess Scott and Scott Bagby and Jerry Vandermill decided that they didn't want to see all this work lost, and they had invested money. So did some of the other companies, and every company was given all the reports and all access to all the information. But they decided that in order to go anywhere, they needed experts, and we were the experts in it, since we did most of the work. Along with a big group of other very important people, but they decided in order to potentially make a product out of this or commercialize it, they would would take a lot more work, and they would need somebody to do it. And they had made us an offer. Nobody else came along. Things at NRC, I was the only NRC employee. Weren't looking that interesting, because it was just going to be move on to some other industrial project and, scare up some more money.
Yep.
Try to convince somebody else to spend more money, because that seemed to be the way the wind was blowing. Was not like they were going to fund me to do my own little pet projects without any industrial component. I didn't really relish the idea of going back into active noise control, so decided to go. So at first, we were, looking at scaling the DSP engine down to something more reasonable, single DSP, and I was looking at, okay, how can we make this all work on one DSP? Because the issue is that a room impulse response, or a room, the time it takes to decay in a room is like a second and a half typically, right, before a single sound completely decays. So the impulse response is a second and a half long. So if you want to do an FIR filter, it's like a second and a half of filtering. So at 44 kilohertz, that's a lot of multiply accumulates. That's like 64,000 samples or more, right? That you have to 64,000 multiply accumulates you have to do at a rate of 44 kilohertz times a second. So that's huge number of computations. So, there are quick ways of doing that, which is like FFT-based ways, but still that introduces then a delay of a second and a half into your audio. That's never going to wash with people trying to watch things and listen to things at the same time, because audio is going to get out of sync. So doing it using an IIR filter, potentially you could reduce it down to something much more manageable, like a certain number of biquad stages, and anyway, reduce everything down to that. So I spent time doing that. Got it along quite a ways, did a number of listening experiments initially, and then still came to the point where we were looking at, okay, we could reduce the cost of the DSP, but that's not the only cost, right? There's like the A to Ds and the D to As, there's the box, the electronics. We just had a hard time seeing that there was a market, in market point. And then there was also one problem, which was a patent that was issued in 1981 on room equalization using digital filters. So it was Teledyne water pick of all places.
Were they active with that? Were they actively using that patent?
They sent people letters during our NRC thing. And the thing was, they had a pretty decent patent, but the U.S. patent system's kind of weird, where you get to have these very broad statements and claims, and one was using a digital equalizer. So any digital equalizer, no matter what you were doing or how you were getting there, was basically patented, which seemed a little, and it should have been obvious at the time because people were doing, room EQ with third octave equalizers and things like that. So to instead use a digital one is really not any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
And they did have some really cool ways of doing this on a TI, I forget what it was, a little keyboard computer thing that they had back in 1981. It was like a microcontroller. And they had some really cool ideas on how to do an FIR, an FIR filter that could actually do something and, at least theoretically enable some kind of EQ.
Now, they had these patents. Was anyone actually using building technology from these patents or building
there was a
product?
There was a box from a company that was associated with them.
Okay.
And they were selling it to studios. It was a very expensive box. Okay. And I think it used a real DSP by then, and it did something. It was a single point equalizer though.
Okay.
So anyway, it was a potential problem, right? So we kind of shelved that. And
now this was the mid 90s.
93.
Okay, early 90s.
93, 94.
Okay.
Yeah. So I only worked on it for maybe 6 months or something at the time. And then kind of shelved it and got into designing subwoofers because subwoofers were hot and we needed a subwoofer. So kind of changed directions for a while. We did come back to the room EQ idea several times after that. Each time we took it a little further, but ended up not coming out with anything because it just didn't seem like the market was going to accept it. Right?
Now,
there's
the market not accepting it, was that because of the audiophile hate? But I mean, generally speaking, a lot of people didn't like the idea of digital in their music.
Yeah, exactly. And those would be if you're going to have a expensive box, they're your target audience because everyone's spending a lot of money on audio gear. And a lot of them, they're not everybody, but there were a lot of them pretty dead set against digital, and they had all kinds of imaginary issues with digital, that it was staircased and all that. They just didn't understand dither or any of that sort of stuff, or information theory or any of that Nyquist theorem. You couldn't convince them. I mean, people were concerned that wearing a digital watch in a room where there was a listening test was going to affect the results. And I mean, okay.
Was there any foundation to those claims or those worries or anything like that? Or was it completely...
yeah, they were pretty bizarre.
Okay.
I mean, it was like the things with little pyramids that you would raise your turntable on little pyramids.
Okay.
Or put a pyramid on top of your amplifier, and that made it sound better.
Oh.
There were some really strange things. Oh, okay.
That's I guess the 90s version of the network switch, the audiophile network switch these days. I don't know if you've heard about those, but also very weird, also unfounded.
Yeah. So anyway, there was a lot of issues back then, and you can talk about codecs. People were really concerned that compressing music and throwing away information was changing it a lot. And they just didn't understand that there's masking, and masking hides a lot of things, and you can't hear everything that's there. Just as the experiment showed with echoes, right? You can put a blip after the main arrival, and at a certain level, you can't hear it.
Interesting.
And, right? So it's the same as, there were a lot of hearing models out at the time, and those hearing models were, like frequency domain models where they had, frequency bands and looked at a lot of the models basically show that if you have two signals and they're in different audio bands or hearing bands, then you can hear them as distinct things. But once the frequencies of the signals start getting close together and fall in the same band, then there's mutual masking. One masks the other. The louder one or the one that arrives first, there's a lot of interaction there. And that's how coders work, coders and decoders, codecs. They work very well. And, anybody trying to do an A/B test with two loudspeakers in a room, it's obvious that their two are different. There's there's very few people that if you put two different speakers in front of them and even if you balance the levels and do lots of things, allow them to switch between the two, they're usually, it's pretty easy to hear the differences. If you try to listen to the difference between a coded piece of music and then, with a good coder and the original, you're going to be really hard pressed. You're going to have to find exactly the right 10-second blip in the right track and listen to it over and over again before you might detect the difference. It's not going to be that obvious. It's very, very subtle. It's like trying to hear a very low level distortion in some amplifier or something. Some of these things are not easy to hear.
Yeah, the theoretical idea is that sure there could be a slight difference, but the reasonable idea is very difficult to reasonably detect.
Yeah. 99.99% of the music that you're listening to, there's no difference that you can detect. So, some things are very audible and some are much more subtle.
So with that, I think now is a good time. Let's take a quick little musical break. And when we get back, let's talk about when Anthem Room Correction, ARC, finally got off the ground and what that kind of meant, and from there on. Sound good?
Okay. Yep.
Peter, what I really want to ask you about now is how did ARC, Anthem Room Correction, find its legs? Like, it got released in 2007. What was it that finally allowed it to kind of see the light of day?
Paradigm had acquired the Sonic Frontiers brand name and company, and we had brought out some surround processors under their Anthem brand name and became our main brand name because it was the transistor part of their line, not the tube part. And we weren't doing tubes. And we had a processor, the D1 and the AVM2 was the first one, then D1 AVM20. Then we went into the D2. And when we brought out the D2, we had dual DSPs and lots of extra horsepower in the box. And when you have a box and you already are selling it as a box with A to Ds and D to As and all this capability, then adding room correction as one of the features was not going to overstress the DSP. We'd be able to, have it on all the time. So I spent time, obviously before that, reviving all the work and creating a PC kind of user interface for doing the measurements and calculating the filters. The algorithms could run, in a reasonable amount of time. Back then, the computers aren't as fast as they are now, and ARC was quite a bit slower in calculating the optimum filter coefficients. And then we had a RS-232 interface back to the computer, or to the box, between the computer and the box. So we could download coefficients and put them into permanent storage so that you could turn on ARC. I think we even had the 2 profiles, so you could have 2 different kinds of setups. It was basically all the channels that were in the D2. So I think it was a 7.1 system. So it could do like 7 full band channels and 1 sub channel. It was based on doing minimum of 5 positions in the room. Typically, we told people, cover the couch and make sure at least the locations are at least a foot apart. Really should be half a meter apart or more. Make sure that the mic isn't always at the same height, because then you're going to not capture differences in the height modes in the room. We also had to source a mic and calibrate this mic. At the time, we used the electric mic. We found a vendor. We had to get them set up a test calibration procedure, because each one was completely different. Well, not completely different, but anyway, plus or minus 3 dB from
a
what
little
you
bit
wanted.
Of variance.
There was huge variance, right, in electret microphones. And a lot of the variance just depended on how hot the soldering iron was, or the soldering was when they connected the wires to the back of the thing, right? Because it's you could melt the diaphragm if you were not careful enough. So anyway, we had to have a calibration. So that created, the original ARC. We had a lot of faith in what it was doing. We could, do some comparison to what was there was one other system out there at the time. I think, I can't even remember the name, but anyway, it was pretty bad sounding. Our reports were that most people tried it and turned it off. And I think one of the things about ARC is that people try it and leave it on. There were some limitations imposed at the time, having to do with the frequency bands going up to the 5 kilohertz, which was done intentionally, because if you go, or I did it intentionally, because I didn't want to mess up with people's tweeters, because a lot of speakers are sold for a specific high frequency kind of sound, right? Like it has a certain sound on, like if it's a ribbon or some magic dome or something. So they have a specific frequency response, like a signature kind of sound for that company. If you equalize that away, then
interesting.
It no longer sounds like whatever it was, right? So, or you affect that more. So I didn't want to mess with, the reason you might have bought this pair of speaker versus that one was potentially the way it sounds at high frequencies, the sibilance or something. And I didn't really want to mess with that. And we're also limited to, I think at the time we were using 10 biquads. So we only had a limited complexity for the EQ. And by not equalizing the high frequencies, you could spend more time at the low frequencies where you could actually make a difference. And we also had another feature that we put in that nobody else had, was we did not design the low frequencies to be flat in the room. We had a lift, and but our lift was it was room dependent. So effectively, we looked at all the measurements, so 5 positions and all the different speakers. And then we looked at the average, sort of curve down there, the average room gain, as you might call it, at low frequencies. There's a room gain due to the size of the room and all the standing waves. And I had this idea that the way you perceive a sound in a certain room, your brain kind of adapts to the room. Sure. So you don't hear you kind of expect things to sound a certain way. You go into a tiny room, it's going to sound more boomy, and you kind of expect that. And so we knew from experiments that if you design it to be flat, it just doesn't sound right. And part of that is
psychoacoustic isn't there.
Yeah, because likely the people who mixed this thing were in a real room with real room gain, right? They're listening to it on a pair of speakers in some other room which has gain.
Yeah.
And if you don't recreate some of that, you have no idea how much gain was in that room, right? But if you don't put something in and you make it flat in your room, then all of a sudden you're missing something.
Interesting.
So my idea was to just look at the gain in the room you're in and then use that as a target. So as a nice smooth target and with a roll off based on how capable your speakers were. So that was part of ARC from day one. And, eventually other people looked at what we were doing because it worked so well and decided that, yeah, this was all a good idea. And then there were several papers from Harmon, Sean Olive looked at, what was the ideal target curve and in their room, which was some kind of their particular listening room. And they came up with a curve that then I think they patented it or something, trademarked it. I don't know.
The Harmon curve.
The Harmon curve, which is quite similar to what we do, right? We're doing at the time because they did some benchmarking with their JBL synthesis system and several others in ours and decided that we did really well, even though it was a completely simple EQ with IIR filters. Everybody else is doing FIR filters and being very complex and not having the right target and not having the right idea, not worrying about things that you can't hear and not worrying about the things that you can hear, or worrying about things that might be extremely difficult to hear and instead of things that are very easy to hear.
So that kind of leads me to this one question, which is speaking to our producer of the show, Dennis, he was mentioning that his first impressions of ARC when he first turned it on, he was just completely floored. But more recently, he pointed out that band limited at 5,000 hertz has been removed. So ARC obviously has evolved over the time. Stuff like removing that band limit, is there a reason for that? Has the technology changed? What was behind that decision?
Mostly just requests. We had, so a lot of the UI and what goes on in ARC now is based on, feedback from the field. So, we have some things have changed over the years. One of them is people wanted to be able, why can't we equalize the high frequency? Well, there's no reason you can't. It's like, why do you want to?
Yeah.
If you want to do that, why not? Right. And, one thing for sure is that if you go, say beyond 10K and you make the room curve flat, it's going to sound bright because compared to lower frequencies, there's a fair amount of absorption in the room at high frequencies. So that means you're pumping a lot of energy in, and the air absorption starts to kick in at those frequencies, and then any kind of materials at all, because the wavelength's so small, it's quite easy to absorb these very high frequencies. And if you flatten it up there, then it's going to get bright. So, but if you want to do it, go ahead. Like in the end, we kind of started doing what, allowing people to do what they want. People wanted to draw their own curves, right? So then we made the UI a lot easier to manipulate the target curve. Right. So you could change some of the things. You could manually override some of the auto kind of settings like the crossover frequencies and things like that.
You still give them the default stuff.
We still give them the default stuff, and the defaults are going to be, it's going to go up to 5K. It's going to pick the room gain to match the room gain in your room.
Yeah.
You can turn it down. Now we had some guys that were so very anal about wanting it flat, low frequencies. Okay, so we let them do it. So, okay, if that's what you want to do. So please the customer in the end. I mean, there's a possible case, for allowing the room gain not to be as much. If you have a lot of gain in your room, maybe you do want it lower than that setting. There's some argument, and it all depends on which music you're listening to and how it was recorded and all that sort of stuff, right? So potentially, if you were listening to a live orchestra recorded in a huge hall where they didn't have a lot of room gain because the room gain kicked in at 20 hertz, below 20 hertz because of the size of the room, then it might sound more authentic if you had no room gain.
Interesting.
Right? So there is some arguments you could make that you might want
cases
a setting.
That might be. Yeah.
Pardon?
Sorry.
Yeah,
it's edge cases that you're kind of allowing to cover, or that you're potentially covering.
Yeah. So, and a lot of what makes ARC such a good program, system now is just the heuristics that are in there. We've had so many users and so much feedback. We've had to hit so many edge cases where somebody, we get people that come to the helpline and say, well, ARC doesn't quite sound right. And you go, well, what's your setup? And they're in a barn and they got speakers in a barn and they're doing a party, right? And that's an edge case, but then we try to accommodate. We get the files from them because we can, ARC has a way of, you just get the ARC file and then you bring it into R&D and start looking at what happened here. Why did it, did it do something reasonable? Did it not do something reasonable? What was, what was it that caused this particular thing to happen? And then we tweak things. So try to cover as many of these kinds of situations that occur. So things have definitely got better in terms of handling more cases, like it can be more widely used. We've added, more and more filters as time went on because there's more and more DSP power. We've increased the ARC to also work at, the original one only worked at 48 kilohertz. Now it'll work at whatever frequency the signal is. That's coming at the end of going towards the DACs, right? ARC is sort of the last process in before things go to the DAC. No, second last. The time alignment is after that. But anyway, it's right near the end of the chain.
So with ARC at its current state, are you happy where it is, or is there kind of more room or more areas that you'd like to explore? Or maybe outside of ARC completely, is there other areas of audio that you want to devote some research time to?
I think there might be some potentials to improve ARC further by, especially at low frequencies, doing the multiple subs instead of doing them independently, doing them all at the same time. So that would be like a multi-point, multi-source kind of a optimization instead of a multi-point single source optimization, which is what ARC is right now, where, each channel is looked at independently. Whereas for subs, there's no reason why you couldn't look at them all playing the same. If they're playing the same signal at the same time, then you could look at the interactions of the subs and probably do a better job at low frequencies. And that's one of the things I'm looking at. That turns out to be a pretty difficult problem, especially if you're trying to do that in a frequency domain. So our optimizations are done in the frequency domain so that we can do logarithmic weighting in frequency, which is like the way your hearing works, whereas designing FIR filters is usually done in the time domain. So then you get linear weighting in frequency. So that's not really the way you hear. So it tends to focus too much of its equalization on higher frequencies because there's just more points at higher frequency because of sampling rate. So that's one area that's interesting to me. we've also got lots of stuff happening in our amplifiers and subwoofers, which is, limiting schemes and ways to avoid distortion when you're overdriving a system, and trying to make that inaudible. So lots of our subs have multiband limiters, because in order to make a sub play loud at 20 hertz, you either have to design a huge sub with whatever, or huge travel and huge mass, and it's very inefficient. So in order to make it efficient, it's basically rolls off before 20. So you equalize it. So if you're adding 10 dB of gain at 20 hertz to make the sub play flat to 20 hertz, when you turn the volume up, 20 hertz is going to clip first.
Huh.
Right. So you have to, in order to avoid 20 hertz clipping, you've got to do something, because it's going to clip long before you stress the higher frequencies, right? And you want it. 20 hertz is not what makes your system sound loud. It's 60 hertz, right? 60 to 100 is where, the sub is really playing. And most of the content is very little content below 60. So you run the risk of clipping things when you have such big EQ at 20 hertz. So pretty much every sub out there has some kind of a limiting scheme in it to change, basically effectively changes the frequency response as the signal gets louder, so that the 20 hertz doesn't overpower, doesn't take all the amp power and cause clipping.
So a lot more, basically there's not an end to the kind of areas that you can explore with the technology.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of things that you can do to improve things, because you're always trying to do something at a lower cost and make it sound better. And
with the technology of the day, which keeps on improving.
Right.
No more 60K storage limits or anything like that.
No, it's pretty much unlimited. And now, it's much more difficult. People are not as much into critical listening as they used to be. Everybody's got the little pods and the Google speakers and Amazon speakers, which on the whole don't sound very good. And yet that seems to be acceptable music. So yeah, it's very hard to compete at that price.
For sure. We spoke about it very briefly in the last episode, the idea of the audiophile haters of digital. Do you find that in today's realm, there's still that kind of apprehension to digital, to the technologies like ARC, or are people more willing to try it out and more willing to use it?
I think for the most part, they are. We used to, I think we still did up till maybe even in this generation. We've always had in our processors lists like digital bypass, so that you could go direct. Okay. For the guys who are really, really wanting to go direct, but then they don't get ARC, they don't get, a lot of this processing, but they just get the input section and the output section and the volume control. And you don't get any multi-channel, right? So unless you have a recording, which is multi-channel PCM, right? Because clearly and even then, it's digital. It's only one DAC. So yeah, I mean, pretty much everything, all the sources now, unless you're going to listen to vinyl, are digital. And I'm sure that vinyl, that recording you're listening to, was digital.
Was processed through a digital stage at some point.
I'm sure it was a digital master. It's not a direct to disc. I remember, I don't know, it's probably before your time, but I used to buy direct to disc recordings. There was basically they cut the master, one master at the recording, and then they would press maybe 1,000 copies. And after that, the master was worn out. You couldn't use it anymore. So it was very limited edition discs, but they were great because they were not mucked with.
Yeah.
That was the best part of direct-to-disc. It didn't go through a mixing studio where guys were mucking with it and doing this and that. They had to get it right the first cut, right? So it was just done without a lot of processing, a lot of effects boxes and all that sort of stuff.
Well, so we're coming to the end of our conversation, and you've been so gracious with your time. That line kind of had me think about the question that I typically ask our guests, which is, I generally say, what is the soundtrack to your life? And I've been kind of changing this around to, what music would you want to play if we were to do a long car drive or something? But is there music that you would just turn on when you just want to relax, nothing to do with testing, nothing to do with work, and you just want to purely enjoy? Is there a direct-to-disc track that you always want to go grab and pull on and press play on?
I would probably listen to some old Beatles stuff, just as something, if it was something special that I wanted to put on. If I'm just generally listening to music, I listen to like alternative music, just modern, new music kind of stuff. I'm not a big fan of reliving listening to an 80s rock channel or a 90s rock channel or all these very restrictive things. I like to hear what people are listening to today and move with the times and see where things are at. So, awesome. And I find alternative music, stuff that wasn't necessarily meant to be commercial.
Yeah.
Not top 40s kind of stuff, which tends to be a lot more interesting and a lot less synthetic.
Is there any songs from your Athena project days that were used during the testing that you hear from time to time that bring you back?
There's a Dire Straits track from Brothers in Arms that we used to use a lot. Can't remember what name of it. There's a Tracy Chapman one that was used a lot. You hear it once in a while. That one's kind of rare to hear. Oh, Jennifer Warren's Bird on the Wire. That was one we used a lot.
That's good.
You hear a lot of different versions of that as well.
Yeah.
It's kind of these are things that are usually quite well recorded and, not mucked with too much in the studio. And I kind of appreciate that kind of stuff where you can hear the highs and the lows and there's content and just enjoy the music.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. I greatly, greatly appreciate your time, and all the best.
Okay. Thank you.